Hey guys, Dr. Justin Marcagiani here. Really excited to be back with y'all. On today's podcast, we have Dr. Jessica Hehmeyer on the show. So, Dr. Jess, how are we doing today?
Doing great, thanks, Dr. J. How are
Awesome. Well,
you?
great. Very nice to meet you. Very nice to meet you. Well, excited to chat today. Your website is wellempowered.com. We'll put links and coordinates if anyone wants to reach out to you. I know you see functional medicine patients all over the world, just like myself. So excited for that. People want to reach out. Coordinates will be down below. So let's chat today. I know one of the biggest things that you focus on a lot of hormonal issues, gut issues, a lot of weight loss, resistance. When you see patients coming in, maybe especially you see a lot of female patients in that perimenopausal, menopausal range. What do you find is like the big top 3 causes of why they're having a hard time losing weight? What are those big weight loss resistance barriers?
Yeah, great question. And one thing, I'm going to break your listeners' hearts right now
Hmm.
and just kind of put it out there and say it's not your thyroid.
Hmm.
So, and I shouldn't say it's not your thyroid. Even if it is your thyroid, it's not only your thyroid. So
Hmm.
certainly we want to make sure your thyroid is humming along and functioning like a dream. But even when that's handled, in my experience, there are actually 3 other metabolic barriers that are recurring in perimenopausal women in particular that really get in the way of their weight loss
Mm.
endeavors, right? And so the top 3 include number 1, elevated inflammation. Right. So
Hmm.
elevated inflammation, and I'm sure you see this, Dr. J, too,
Hmm.
right? Sometimes people come in and they say, oh my gosh, I'm so inflamed. And they tell you about their symptoms. My joints hurt, or I'm bloated, or my skin's red, whatever the case may be. But more often than not, inflammation is elevated without any symptoms, but we can do labs. We can actually measure inflammation. So we want to measure inflammation and see if that's one of the barriers to their weight loss, right? So we get the numbers whether someone has symptoms or not. Their symptom may only be that they're struggling to lose weight, right? So inflammation is number 1. Number 2 is compromised insulin sensitivity, which is a
Hmm.
far cry from lab normal, right? Lab normal insulin, fasting insulin, is 19 or less. I
Right. It's
like to
crazy.
see it. It's crazy.
Yeah.
It's
Nuts.
bananas, right? So,
Yeah.
kind of like 7 is where I'd like to see
Yeah.
it, or less,
I
right?
think 7 or 7 is good. 7 or
Yeah.
below.
Yeah. 7 or
Hmm.
below is good,
Hmm.
right? So many people, I'm sure you see this all day long, right? They're far outside of that range, right? But they're walking around thinking it's normal because it's in the quote unquote lab normal range. And then, the last thing that I see, and this involves a lot of different things, but I like to say detox pathways gunked up. So
Hmm.
detox pathways gunked up because when our detox pathways aren't rolling well, and those are physiological processes, right? Like the word detox is so chic these days, and
Right.
people get latched onto it real quickly. But the truth is these are physiological processes happening in our body, and when they're not
Yep.
working well, we reabsorb our toxins. And we don't just reabsorb the toxins we encounter in our environment. Our hormones go through those detox pathways too, so we reabsorb those hormones, and
Hmm.
and so all of that together can really set the stage for someone's metabolism moving along at the pace of a snail.
Hmm. Yep, I totally agree. Now, when you talk about, so if we kind of summarize that, we talked about detoxification, we talked about insulin resistance and
Mm-hmm.
inflammation. And it's important when you have thyroid issues, for instance, your thyroid very rarely just spontaneously combusts. There's other factors upstream with the different systems, right? You talked about insulin resistance, inflammation. Also, inflammation can drive insulin resistance because now you're, as part of the stress response, right? You're surging cortisol, which is mobilizing more glucose, which is then potentially creating more insulin problems. And so, most of the time when you have an organ dysfunction downstream, there's so many things upstream that can easily get ignored while you're focusing on the downstream kind of organ, if you will. You agree?
Absolutely, absolutely. Oh yeah, totally. And even, just as you were so eloquently tying together the impact of inflammation on insulin, it's like,
Right.
yeah, this is all a dance. It's rarely just one thing. There's usually an interplay. When people aren't detoxifying things well, their, toxins are building up in their body. That's going to drive inflammation too. There's probably some
Yeah.
kind of disruption in their microbiome, which definitely, impacts everything, metabolism to mood and immune function, all of it. Mm-hmm.
Now, how are you assessing inflammation? Like in my practice, we may run certain gut tests that look at calprotectin or EPX, or your just typical blood markers like C-reactive protein or homocysteine. What are some of your kind of ways that you can assess someone has inflammation outside of like they're just inflamed, they have joint pain issues, they have a lot of pain issues in the body? what are some of your other clinical ways you dive deeper into that?
Yeah, well, exactly. We just as you were saying, we get numbers on them, right? So for the person, right, certainly we're going to do some blood labs, right? So we're going to get that HSCRP that you mentioned. We're going to
Yeah.
get that homocysteine that you mentioned. And then if it seems germane, and often it does, especially when it's weight loss resistance, getting some of those gut markers, whether it's calprotectin or
Uh-huh.
lactoferrin or,
Yep.
all those
Yep.
different
Yep.
things.
That's fair. That's a good one. Yep.
So we will get those numbers and use it to understand, is this playing a role? And, how significant is it, just a mild inflammation that's really the side effect of something else? Or is this inflammatory process driving the dysfunction? And we need to really go after it hot and heavy before we're going to make any progress.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so what are a couple of strategies, what are the big kind of vectors that you see out of the gates with patients as a means to knock down inflammation? Are you making diet changes? And if so, like what are some of the typical foods that people are consuming that are throwing them off inflammation wise, making them more inflamed?
Yeah.
And then what are some of the big supplements you may use to kind of help put out the fire too?
Yeah. So supplements and nutrition, huge aspects that we dive into, when we're working with someone when their inflammatory load is,
Hmm.
high. So from a nutritional perspective, the ones that are, foods and beverages that are going to be driving inflammation, number one enemy is sugar, right?
Of course.
And
Yeah.
yeah, and people can have normal insulin, normal, optimal glucose, optimal fasting insulin, even optimal hemoglobin A1C. All those things are optimal, and yet sugar is still driving inflammation, right? So
Hmm.
the other systems just haven't taken a hit yet,
Yeah.
right? Give them 10 years, you'll see it if you don't do anything, right?
And that's where
So
fasting insulin I find is helpful. I find fasting insulin will go awry, or some kind of a functional glucose tolerance where you're measuring your glucose like an hour or two after your meal. Usually you can see, a response issue in those kind of lab markers.
yeah, absolutely. I totally agree. So, sugar definitely public enemy number one. And then,
Hmm.
although not sweet, right? The simple carbs, which functionally speaking are sugar, right? Of
Hmm.
course.
Get
And
broken down
then,
to that. Yep.
yeah. And then also it's a deficit, right? It's like, what don't you have, right?
Hmm.
If your caloric, what composition is favoring all these things that are creating inflammation, you're also not consuming things that are anti-inflammatory. So it's a little bit of what are you doing and what aren't you doing? And when I
Hmm.
work with people, we actually look at their truth. We don't just guess. So I have people, I work off of a shared platform where I'm tracking their nutrition on a daily, they're tracking their nutrition and I'm seeing it, on a regular
How do you track it? Are you
basis.
using Chronometer or MyFitnessPal? How are you doing it?
I do it old school. I make people use Google Sheets. So I
Mhm.
have a Google Sheets
Yeah.
document that I've created. And,
Hmm.
one of the things I love about that, Dr. J, is people really think, right? It makes them think at a different level. And they also track a lot of different things on that, right? They're
Hmm.
able to start to gather their insights. I realize when I don't get more than 6 hours sleep, I'm starving by 3 o'clock and can't have no control over my choices. Or, like they can gather insights that help lead them to changes that really are sustainable, right?
Hmm.
So I do work off of an old school Google Sheets. And so, like, okay, what's causing, of course, alcohol can be in there, right? And in high amounts, alcohol is definitely going to be driving
Yep.
inflammation. And then in the way of, okay, what are we going to do about it from a supplemental standpoint? Well, of course, we're going to do things about it nutritionally, pulling things out and putting things in. Supplements, the Mariva form of curcumin. So curcumin,
Yeah.
as I'm sure your listeners have heard from you, is the active
Yeah.
ingredient in turmeric.
Yeah.
And not all curcumin is created equally. I'm
Hmm.
sure you've played around with it clinically as well. But,
Yep.
for me, it's just Mariva hands down. Like that's the form we're using. And we're using it in high doses, which might be, 1,000 milligrams 3-4 times a day.
And that's going to be a liposomal kind of curcumin absorption system, right? Because I think 95% of curcumin, if it's not in some kind of a liposomal carrier or like a black pepper carrier, you're going to only absorb a very small percent. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah. And you're
Yeah.
not going to see the movements that you will when you use the appropriate form. Yeah,
Correct. Yep.
absolutely.
That makes sense.
So yeah, that, and, sometimes depending on what those inflammatory markers look like, or if we retest and they haven't moved as much as we want, I'll use SPMs, like pro-resolving mediators, right? When someone's body is just really locked into the inflammatory, vicious cycle, and we can't get that number to move like we would expect, then I'll go in there with some the pro-resolving mediators. I'll also use omega-3 fatty acids, both in their diet as well as supplement, in the way of supplement. And we check those numbers so that we make sure we dose it according to their needs.
How are SPMs different than fish oil? Is it like concentrated fish oil? What's the difference?
It's basically further down the chain of biochemistry. And I have, I've looked at this a few times, and I don't have it top of mind to give you a great explanation other than to say the EPA and the DHA rather, EPA and DHA, right? The active forms of omega-3s, as they go through enzymatic processes, eventually they arrive at these pro-resolving mediators. And so I will use them both together on certain people, because just fundamentally speaking, that's what you need. And if they can be really, really effective in helping when you just can't get that number to move.
Do you use the SPM active one by Metagenics?
I do. I like that one. I do like that one. It's concentrated. It works well. Yeah, I like that. Mm-hmm.
Okay, cool. So we have fish oil. We have a liposomal curcumin. I think that's really important. Any other big supplements that you use kind of in your back pocket to kind of really reduce inflammation?
I mean, ultimately, I use what people need, right? So I'm looking at their labs and I'm making choices specifically based on that, right? As you know, right, if their B12 is measuring 300, we want it, 800, 900, we know their detox pathways are all gunked up, right? And so we're going to use B12 at a level that their body needs, and that's going to be a different workaround to help their body resolve inflammation. So acknowledging the different ways that we can come in and affect, what's at the source of inflammation.
So of course you're going to individualize some of that with some lab testing, so you'll figure out kind of what nutrients or what other issues.
Absolutely.
Any other specific herbals that you find that kind of are helpful for reducing inflammation? Like, do you have an experience with like Boswellia or CBD or any systemic enzymes?
Boswellia and ECGC, right? The active ingredient in green tea. Yeah, those will be some things I'll throw in there if needed. But honestly, I got to tell you, it's like it just cannot be underestimated, the power of a real high quality, curcumin. It goes so far that oftentimes that's really just what we need.
Oh yeah, if you look at a lot of the drug companies right now, if you look at kind of their pipeline, they're taking a lot of these herbs and these compounds, and they're trying to take little isomers of these herbs so they can kind of patent it and then get some of the benefits. But when you take an herb,
like they did with omegas,
Yeah, with the omegas, yeah, exactly. And they charge hundreds of dollars, per prescription when it could be a fraction of that, over the counter. But yeah, so they're trying to take these little isomers, but when you take an herb out of context, right, you may have side effects, plus there's other nutrients and antioxidants within the herbal complex. So you can't, it's hard to really patent nature, but that's how they're doing it to be able to bring it to market, because they need to have a massive, profit incentive to spend the millions on the clinical trial. So yeah, I get it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so where does food come in here? I mean, you talked about sugar and glucose. Obviously that impacts insulin resistance, that, cortisol surges, glycation, all of that. But what about your typical food allergens? What are the big things that you see, outside of like your typical, gluten's pretty trendy now. We know gluten's a big thing. What's your take on food allergens as a whole?
So I think about them in a few different ways, but to first kind of speak to the most common, we have got food sensitivities and we have food allergies, right? Okay. So sensitivities, delayed reactions can take up to 72 hours to show up. These are the ones that people are going to not know that they're reacting until they've gone a long time without them and bring them back in, right? Yeah, there are food sensitivity tests, but that's a different conversation. And then food allergies, right? These are typically more immediate responses. People will know within, a minute to 30 minutes, usually with a true food allergy, what food they're reacting to, right? So with food sensitivities, yes, of course, gluten is a big one. But I'm sure your listeners are probably pretty well educated. Gluten, dairy, yeast is a big one.
Does that include like nutritional yeast, like nutritional yeast, B vitamins kind of things, or no?
Typically not as much, but sometimes I would say I will base that based on a microbiome assessment, right? If
Yeah.
I see someone's yeast off the charts, I'm going to pull all yeast out of there. If I'm not doing something like that and I don't have, huge reason to suspect it's that level of a reaction, then I'm going to be a little bit more flexible with things like nutritional yeast.
So what are the big yeast foods? Is it just more like fermented foods, or what would be those foods?
I mean, gluten-free bread,
Yep.
right? Name it,
Yeah.
name the gluten-free fill in the blank,
Yeah.
that
Got
has
it. Got
yeast
it.
in it.
Any of your
Yeah.
processed flours, processed grains that are so-called gluten-free, right? That makes
Yeah,
sense.
exactly. Exactly. So, pulling those foods out goes a long way. And, making sure people are not just well educated, but are actually taking the actions
Hmm.
required to keep their blood sugar level stable. And that's
Okay.
one of the great things of the shared tracker is, I always think you may have had this experience too, right? I joke that I have like this amazing knack for picking out the right day to meet with people when the day before their nutritional habits were just totally out of whack. And what I mean by that, it's like, in a first appointment, one of the things I'll say is, can you walk me through what you had to eat yesterday from start to finish? And I would say, Dr. J, maybe 80% of people say, oh, yesterday wasn't a normal day. It's like, it doesn't
Right.
matter which day of the week. It's
Yeah.
like, okay, maybe we'd expect that on Monday because Sunday,
Right.
blah, blah. It doesn't matter what day of the week it is. 80% of the people say, yesterday wasn't a normal day, right?
Right.
So I say that because people come to this with really good intentions, and mastering nutrition isn't just about information. It's about, yes, it is about, you need the information. You need effective information for your body, for sure. But there's also, the saying, knowledge is effective action. So it's how do we help you create changes that produce the outcomes you care the most about, but also that you can sustain, right? Because if it's not a sustainable action, it's not a sustainable outcome, and I'm not interested in that.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right, that's cool. So out of the gate here, we talked about food. We talked about some of the lab markers. That's good. Any other big kind of hidden inflammation vectors that may fly under the radar for some people or even some clinicians?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think insufficient sleep is a huge one.
Yep.
Huge one. I,
Yep.
I, I do not think people are starting to catch on, but I think there is just such a huge, it's an underrated point of leverage, right? When people are routinely not getting enough sleep or sleeping restlessly, whatever the case may be, it's definitely going to drive inflammation. It's, I think about the people who I've worked with over the years, and, one woman who comes to mind, she, on her journey to lose weight, she realized along the way that she was diagnosed with sleep apnea, got a CPAP machine. She
Yeah.
actually wore it, which is great. And one of the things she noticed that was totally unanticipated was that it completely changed her mood. She had had a history of anxiety and depression, and sleeping well, I mean, no surprise to you and me,
Yeah.
but like, how cool for her to have that experience. So
Yeah.
obviously not everybody in the sun, fortunately, has sleep apnea and needs a CPAP machine. It's
Yeah.
just to illuminate, the myriad benefits of quality sleep, whether it's mood or helping your body resolve inflammation, because so much of our body's work in taking out the trash happens at night, happens while we're sleeping.
Yeah. And I find sleep apnea too, like that's still a result of typically inflammation. Like it's that
Yep.
blockage of the
Yep.
airway. I mean, so a CPAP's kind of a band-aid, but if it
Yep.
gets you better sleep in the meantime while you fix those things, then it's kind of helps bridge the gap. And it's okay as long as it's kind of pushing you towards that better state of healing for sure.
Absolutely. Totally. Yeah. It
Yeah.
moves you along the trajectory of your
Yeah,
healing
exactly.
journey. Yeah.
People talk about inflammation too. I like to just clearly define it because inflammation is good to a certain degree. There's a hormetic inflammatory response of lifting weights, and that muscle builds back a little bit stronger. And you eat certain foods or certain nutrients, you get this hormetic response where you have a little bit of inflammation, but then your anabolic response to it's a little bit greater. So in the end, you're getting stronger. I think inflammation is more of that inflammatory response without that anabolic response. So you're breaking down a little bit more than you're building up, which puts you on a trajectory for pain, joint pain, hormonal issues, fatigue issues, sleep issues. Would you agree?
Oh yeah, completely. You described it perfectly, right? And it's the fertilizer for all the things in the world nobody wants, right? In the way of disease processes. So, it can be the first maybe every other metric looks great and this is the one thing that's out of whack. It's like, great, let's play whack-a-mole on that thing right now
Yeah.
and turn this around.
Yes, exactly. Well, you're talking about weight loss. I'm just curious, where does your take on the calorie model kind of fall? I'm just curious to get your take on that and how that connects to weight loss.
Yeah. So calories are a part of the equation and they're not the
Hmm.
whole story,
Hmm.
right? In other words, the law of thermodynamics is real,
Hmm.
right? So we acknowledge that I'll just say yes, calories play a role, but there's
Hmm.
more to the story, right? So how foods impact our hormones has a
Hmm.
huge, huge effect on our metabolism. It also has a huge effect on whether we experience satiety or hunger, which then affects our caloric intake, right? So we've got the caloric impact, we've got the hormonal impact, and we have the inflammatory impact. I would add in that inflammatory impact, the impact food has on our microbiome, right? Because our microbiome's impact on our metabolism is tremendous also. So, from a high level, we've got calories, we've got hormones, and we've got inflammation. And then as a subset of inflammation, we want to really acknowledge microbiome as playing a big role.
Yep, that makes sense. Yeah, because when you look at calories, right, a calorie is nothing more than taking essentially an amount of food, right, a calorie, and the amount of energy it takes to heat 1 gram of water 1 degree Celsius. That's it. The problem with
Mm-hmm.
that model is there's no impact in satiation. There's no impact in these neuropeptides that get produced that allow you to feel satiated. Hormones. Hormones are the air traffic controller that tells calories where to go. Go to the mitochondria, get burned. Go to the fat. Go to the liver, get stored. Go into the muscle, get converted to glycogen. Right? There isn't that signal. So when you look at it, calorie as a whole, you got to look at the hormonal aspects. Also, I think you have to look at the nutrient density aspect because you can have a calorie of processed sugar that has virtually zero nutrition, or you can have the same calorie from an egg yolk that has vitamin A and all these nutrients in there that are going to be so important for satiation. And so I think the nutrient density aspect is important because the more nutrients you get per calorie, the more chance that you're going to feel satiated. But you also have the nutrients to run these metabolic pathways. And you get other things like peptide YY, adiponectin, cholecystokinin that tell you to feel full. And then if you're keeping your carbs in check, that's going to be putting more of your fats into the mitochondria to get burned versus to get stored in the liver or in the muscles. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned one of my favorites there, cholecystokinin. I
Yeah.
remember, learning about this hormone and being totally amazed
Yeah.
by it, right? And
Gallbladder
thinking
function.
back to the 90s when the fat-free craze was the
Olestra,
rage.
right? Olestra.
Oh my God. Well,
Chips too.
yeah,
Yeah.
right. All that stuff, right?
Yeah.
Nastiness supreme. But, avoiding fat, how we produce cholecystokinin is through eating fat, and
Yeah.
cholecystokinin cues satiety. And
Hmm.
so we weren't eating fat, so we weren't cueing satiety. So we were eating more fat-free crap, to
Yes.
be quite honest,
Yeah.
right? And it just was, it was just a hot mess.
Oh yeah. And I find calories are definitely like an end result. The question is, why are you eating too many calories? Because if the nutrients are there, the data is very clear. People that eat more fat, eat more protein, and a lot of studies actually tend to go a little bit lower on the calories. And it's not because they're actively trying, it's because they have better satiation mechanisms to say, stop. I do think people that eat too fast, a couple of bites per chew, because you're going to get so many more nutrients and calories in your system before that feedback system says, hey, chill out, you got enough. So I do think eating a little bit slower, taking a little bit longer to chew your food up, maybe giving yourself another 5 minutes before you go back for seconds. I think the food timing aspect is important. Your thoughts?
Yeah, totally agree. And I also say, along with that, chewing is like mostly if we're eating nutrient dense foods, and I would say in particular in that because, obviously proteins are essential, healthy, nutrient dense fats, essential. But if we're thinking about, our colorful vegetables and things like that, right?
Yep.
It's really hard to eat them quickly. Like
It
I
is.
dare you to
Yes.
swallow a salad whole. Like you
It's true.
cannot do it, right? And so it's kind of like, you want to hack that one, eat a salad and
Yeah.
put your protein on it and put your avocado and put your olive oil, blah, 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 right?
Yeah.
All that stuff. And you will eat it slowly because there is no way to eat it quickly.
Yeah. And then the cholecystokinin that you get from your gallbladder
Mm-hmm.
into the small intestine, if you do too much, you will get nauseous. I mean, it's why it's hard to eat more
Mm-hmm.
than a dozen eggs at a time. But, everyone has experience of eating too much pizza or too much, processed food of your choice, right?
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, that
Mm-hmm.
makes sense. And also, I look at calories too as, are you eating enough? Because if you're low calorie, you're probably low nutrition. And if you're low
Mm-hmm.
nutrition, well, which organ system is going to be the one that gets shorted, so to speak?
Yeah, yeah, no, that's well said. That's well said. I will say there certainly are times when people are under eating,
Hmm.
but I will say mostly my experience is exactly what you were pointing to, Dr. J, in that they're eating more calories than ideal, mostly given by they're not cueing their satiety,
Yes.
right? And so it's, they actually are hungry. It's not
Hmm.
like they're necessarily, quote unquote, stuffing themselves or anything like that. They're just not, they're hungry and they're eating. And so they're eating more and they're low nutrient foods. And so at the end of the day, more often than not, it's more calories than ideal for that person.
Yeah, I tell patients always start your proteins and fats with your meal because that's it's gonna hold up a lot of the food in your stomach, so it sits there a little bit longer, so you get a little bit more of the stretch reflex, fill it up,
Mm-hmm.
and then you do your proteins and fats. You do some good fiber in there because fiber does add bulk to your tummy. It does make you feel more full. Plus, it's takes like you said, it takes some time to chew that food up. Gives you a little more time for your brain to catch up signal wise. And then if you throw any carbs on top of that, usually you're going to have your appetite more in control because you already have that satiation going. So you can say, okay, I'm going to have maybe only a handful or two of some Siete chips, and I'm okay, right? You can kind of push it back a little bit.
Totally. Yeah. And as you were speaking there, what just came to mind was I'm like, oh my gosh, yeah, Dr. J is like describing to a T natural Ozempic, natural
Yep.
Wegovy,
Yeah.
natural, it's
Yeah.
like
Exactly.
natural Manjaro. Okay, there you
Yeah.
go. Just
Exactly.
listen to what Dr. J just said, and
Yeah.
you've hit all of the physiological touch points that these drugs are hitting.
Yeah. And then let's hit that too. Do these newer peptide medications like the Ozempic or the Mounjaro, do they have a role at all for certain people
I
or in
actually
general?
do think they have a role for certain people. Um, and and okay, who would those people be, right? So first of all, it would be someone who is quite literally not willing to make any changes.
Hmm. Yep.
That then if they are morbidly obese and they're not willing to make changes, or maybe they feel so overwhelmed by what's ahead, okay, maybe that's probably a better choice than nothing, right?
Yep.
Probably. And I say the probably part because we want to acknowledge that there are unknowable unknowns, right? There are unknowable
Right.
unknowns in the long-term use of these
Hmm.
things. And if you want to keep the outcomes long-term, you got to keep using them long-term. So
I saw
there's
I
that.
saw it's helping with addictions too, but it's like, well, that's
Yes.
another, if it's helping with that, well, what other things maybe that are unwanted side effects are happening too? So
Yeah.
it almost seems like there's some parts of the brain in certain people that control satiation that are just fried.
Yeah.
And these are the people that even if you give them a steak, they may eat two 20-ounce steaks, right? There's just they miss that satiation signal. And even healthier foods, it's better, right? But they're still missing that, hey, you're good. You've had enough, like
Mhm.
put it back. And I think that's where it could maybe play a little bit of a role.
Mhm.
Anything else on any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think you're totally right. And I think about that, and I'm sure you've encountered people like
Mhm.
this, right? Um, we are all born into whatever family and situation we're born into. And for all of us, I think we would say there are things we got really lucky on, and there are things that we're like, oh, darn, wouldn't that have been
Yeah.
nice?
Yeah.
Kind of a situation,
Yeah.
right? And that's fine. That's life, right? But there are people who, for a million different reasons, maybe they had a single mom, or maybe both their parents were working overtime, or whatever the situation was. But maybe their dinner and lunches when they were 6 and 7 years old were kind of like whatever you want. And I mean, I don't know about you, when I was 6 or 7
Yeah.
years old, I probably would have eaten Twinkies and Ho-Hos all day, right?
Yep.
So it's like they've got this physiological memory that's like decades and decades old. And so what you're talking about with that satiety, it's like it's not their fault.
Yeah.
It's like
Yeah.
this could be useful in helping their body. And my real wish is that it leads to a future where they're able to
Yeah.
pull away the training wheels.
Yeah.
I hope.
Yeah.
And my concern is that if it's working and they're losing weight, are they learning anything new about how to fuel themselves in a way that's a good fit for
Yeah.
the outcomes they're committed to? But
And I guess that appetite kind of issue would fall more under the leptin resistance kind of umbrella, right? I know
yeah,
insulin resistance and leptin resistance are intimately connected. So the more
yeah,
sensitive your insulin gets, the more sensitive your leptin should get, which is that satiation signal. There's other things going on there too. So, but like you were talking about, memory stuff. I mean, I can think of, I haven't eaten at McDonald's in 20 plus years, but I can drive by a McDonald's and smell the fries from the road. And you just get these flashback memories. You're like, oh my God, that was so good.
That's how
That ever happened
Annie
to you?
Ann's is for me. I can't tell you the last time I had Annie Ann's. It's probably 25 years ago also, but when I'm walking through an airport, I'm like, oh man,
Yeah.
that smells good.
That smells good. Exactly. So let's plug in some like some perimenopausal patients or menopausal patients, right? How do these principles plug into them? There's also a book that's kind of getting traction out there called Fast Like a Girl, and it talks a lot about fasting principles for cycling women, menopausal women, perimenopausal women. So first off, do you make any different changes in regards to diet or lifestyle? And then how do you plug in fasting modalities if you do anyway?
Yeah. So when it comes to the cadence of eating, in other
Hmm.
words, like the timing of eating, right? I really do collaborate with the people in front of me on that because for a lot of women, they have many decades of stuff of their relationship around food, and a lot of people have had some kind of disordered eating, right? I don't mean eating disorder, maybe some have, but
Yep.
disordered eating of sorts, right? So when it comes to fasting, I'm always interested in finding out from the person in front of me, does this feel like punishment, right? Does this feel like it is you being mean to you? And if
Hmm.
it does, then it's not a solution I'm interested in. So typically, I'll start with people in looking at the composition of their
Hmm.
nutrition in whatever the case may be, and making those shifts, and then start fine tuning it based on what we're seeing in the way of outcomes. So I'm just not dogmatic when it comes to fast, not fast, snack, not snack. I really do work with the person and we start to make changes and we see how their body responds. And if we need to go make more changes, if I do need to suggest, okay, let's bring in fasting to
Yeah.
whatever extent makes sense for them, then we will. But
Do
yeah,
you have a
I'm not.
background being an RD, a dietitian?
So I have an LDN. So LDN is like the graduate equivalent of an RD.
Oh, got it. Got it. Okay, cool. And so do you use any good like calorie counters that look at nutrients as well, so you can get a sense of the nutrient density along with what they're eating too?
I actually don't. I don't.
Okay.
Sometimes I'll have one. I will say. Sometimes I'll have people turn to my Fitness Pal, which is high level, kind of generic, but it's okay, right? So sometimes I will use my Fitness Pal with people, but mostly I find with people we what can happen is, I'm sure you've seen the video of the rocks in the sand, right? And trying to fit
Yep.
them all in, right? When we focus on the rocks, like everything, unless someone
Yep.
has really mastered all those rocks,
Yep.
then we're not going to focus on the granular sand. And
Right.
mostly when they have, it's like it just all handles
Yeah.
itself,
And
right?
essentially, it's the jar, right? Where you put the rocks in. Okay, it's stuffed. Then you throw the sand in. Oh, you get way more than you could with just the rocks alone. And then you put the water in after that, right? And you can keep on finding more space to fill everything up. At the
Exactly,
mindset.
exactly.
Yeah.
So what I mean by that is, in the nutrient aspect, I think
Yeah.
about that more like the sand,
More granular,
right?
smaller.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly, exactly. So if we're
More
focusing on
nuanced.
yeah, exactly, exactly. So it's just infrequent that we need to go there. But
Mhm.
if we need to, we will. But
Yeah.
mostly we don't.
Plus, you kind of know if like, okay, you're eating processed flours and sugar, and now we're getting you to eat some grass-fed meat and a big salad. Okay, we know the nutrient density is going up. We can see that, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
And so how do you adjust macronutrients? I mean, you're obviously a leaner person. I find sometimes you get people that are leaner, they do well on carbohydrates. And so they're like, they
Hmm.
kind of have their own personal bent, like, oh, I feel great with a couple servings of starch a day and some more fruit, and I do okay. How do you kind of look at what you need, but then also try to personalize it for what your patients need?
Hmm. Well, I consider people's activity level,
Hmm.
right? I also consider how they feel, how they feel when they consume different carbohydrates.
Yeah.
And I look
Is
at
there a
their
default
labs.
starting point that you find that most people, maybe you start a little bit lower carb, a middle of the road carb, and then you kind of adjust? Is there a general starting point that
Yeah, yeah,
if
yeah.
someone comes in that's overweight, you kind of put them in?
Yeah, so I do not go to specific grams of carbs, but what
Hmm.
I do is I focus on the quality of carbs, right?
Hmm.
So like we
Hmm.
said earlier, we want to keep those simple carbs to a minimum. By a minimum, it really depends on where people are starting from,
Hmm.
right? So some people, the first step might be, okay, simple carbohydrates once a day, but where I want them to be is maximum of one serving of simple carbohydrates twice a week, right? That might be the future we're working towards. But I think about it like crossing the monkey bars. We want you to grab the next rung as opposed to go all the way, reach too far, fall off, and feel defeated and not get back on. Right. So, but in the way of the quality of their carbohydrates, like, vegetables are carbohydrates. I'm going to give a whole different value assignment, a different value assignment to, roasted broccoli with sweet potatoes than I am to, the bread, so to speak. So I am going to encourage people to load up on those nutrient dense carbs at least twice a day. Getting heavy-handed with those nutrient-dense carbs, half a plate twice a day, the higher fiber legumes kind of situation if people tolerate them well, at least once a day, and I, pulling out the sugars and the simple carbohydrates that aren't a good match for their outcomes.
That makes sense. And so, what does a typical day look like for you? Like, is there
Yeah.
a certain level where you do this many servings of starch, or like what allows you to feel the best in a certain like
Um,
breakfast, lunch, and dinner breakdown?
yeah. Okay. So my breakfast, I
Hmm.
love a good smoothie.
Hmm.
So I Monday through Friday, I typically do a smoothie. Saturday and Sunday, I do avocado toast with 2 eggs, gluten-free toast, one piece of gluten-free toast, 2 eggs. Um, and lunch
Is it gluten free like corn or rice or oat base, or is it more like a yuca
so
cassava kind of thing?
as I shared with you before we hopped on, we live in Switzerland right now. So in
Yeah.
Switzerland, what I can get is different than the States. So when I'm in the States, I love cauliflower sandwich rounds. They're
Oh,
like,
cool. Yep.
they might be the number one thing I miss.
Nice.
They're so good, right? You can find them at Trader Joe's. They have an in-house brand, and then the brand itself can be the
It's a
cauliflower
cauliflower
sandwich.
wrap kind of thing, or what is it?
It's actually it's like it's a nice size. It's like the size of a corn tortilla, maybe a
Yep.
little bit smaller, and it's got a nice spongy thickness to it. It's got for people who can't do dairy, it has a little bit of Parmesan in it, but most people who are lactose intolerant are fine with it. But it's made with some eggs, so it has some protein in there also. And so in the States, I'll take one of those and do some avocado mash on top of it with a fried egg, and then have another fried egg on the side. That's my fave. But here I'll
Good.
do like a millet and chia gluten-free toast, one piece of that.
Yep.
And then for lunch I am a salad girl. I love my salads, and
Yeah.
I mean huge salads, like
Yeah.
really really big salads.
Yeah.
So
It's good.
lots of mixed greens. I will use
Nice.
leftover vegetables from the night before, always some kind of protein, whether it's
Yeah.
chicken or salmon or whatever protein we have on hand. I'll do that. Usually some lentils in there.
Hmm.
Kind of, to me, I think one of the things I think about with these nutrient dense foods, people's reference point, they're like, oh, you're going to make me eat a chef salad. I'm like, oh God, I would not eat I'd throw a chef salad at me if you told me I had to eat a chef salad every day. It's like there's so many ways to make super delicious, interesting, nutrient dense foods. So always some avocado on my salad, like that's my thing. And then for dinner, we'll rotate through our proteins. We always have a half a plate of vegetables at dinner. We typically go out to dinner twice a week. Friday and Saturdays, we usually go out. The other nights I usually cook. And some nights I'll make some black rice. Maybe one night I'll make bean pasta and serve it with some kind of protein and lots of veggies. That's kind of, and then for snacks, in the States, I love I'm like a savory gal. So I like
Yeah.
bean chips with hummus. That's like one of my fave snacks. And here I'll do corn chips with hummus.
Nice. And
Yeah.
then, so you're in Switzerland. So how about the cheese or the dairy out there? How is it? You try it at all often?
Yeah, yeah, it's delicious. I've never
Yeah.
been, I sometimes I'll put some cottage cheese on my salad. Dairy's never been a problem for me from a digestive standpoint. I do well with it. It's fine with my
Yep.
skin, all those things. My hormones are fine.
Hmm.
I don't like, oh my gosh, have to have dairy, but I like dairy. So I'll have a little, maybe when we're out, I'll get some kind of salad and maybe it will have some dairy on it. But it is the cheese here is amazing. It definitely is amazing. It's not my kryptonite, but it is amazing.
Yeah. That's good. Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, cool. Excellent. So we hit a lot of different topics here today in the podcast. Anything else you wanted to emphasize or leave the listeners with?
Oh, I would say, for those of you who are listening out there and are kind of, your wheels are spinning about where to start, what I would invite you to start with is asking yourself a question
Mm,
the next time you're about to, whether it's eat or think about moving, exercising, things like that. And the question is, what is the best game I can play right now? What is the best game I can play right now? In what that question, if you think about it and answer it honestly, will give you access to is is really just choosing the best game for the moment at hand, right? Rather than being dogmatic and playing
mhm.
your best game over and over again and being in that journey, it will take you so far, so far.
Excellent. Well, Dr. Jesse, appreciate you being on the podcast here today. Wellnessempowered.com, correct? Wellnessempowered.com. We'll
Well
put the
empowered, well
oh, okay.
empowered.
Wellempowered.com. I think I have the right link down below here in the video. Yep, I got the right one. So if you're driving or you're out and about, click down below. You'll have the link right to your site here. And now you see patients on the functional medicine side. Anything else you want to say to listeners, coordinate wise?
No, thank you so much, Dr. J. It's been a pleasure to be here with you and your tribe.
Thanks, Dr. Jesse. Really appreciate it. You take care. Have a good one.
You too. Take care.
Bye.